I guess my frustration came to a head one winter night in 1967 when I decided somebody needs to paint the Indian differently. Because here is a subject matter that is probably the world's worst cliche, at least in this country. And when I did my first Indian, people just freaked out. I knew they would. The first Indian had green hair. It, it was pretty abstract. And then I stenciled in, just to make sure people knew what it was, Indian on the background, lettered it in.
I'm joined here today by Garth Greenan, founder of Garth Greenan Gallery, New York, which opened its doors in 2013. Garth has had 27 artists on the roster, including Howardina Pindell. He's a pioneer in finding and representing the underrepresented, artists who've been unfairly overlooked. Garth has been a member of the Art Dealers Association of America since August 2020, and we're here today to talk about Fritz Scholder, the subject of the current exhibition in your gallery in New York. Fritz Scholder has been a pioneer of a radically different kind of art. He was 1/4 American Indian, and we'll get into the history of that in a bit. I got to see some of Scholder's art in person last week at the gallery. I personally would describe it as colorful and controversial. To me, I saw some notes of pop art of the 60s and 70s. We'll get into all of that in a bit. I have some questions. Hi, Garth. Welcome. Please tell us a bit more about yourself if you like, and then we'll unpack our featured artist, Fritz Scholder, with some more questions. How are you doing?
Okay. I'm well, and happy to be here. I started the gallery in 2011. I had a business partner at the time that was only for a year. I was the junior partner. He was the senior partner. I don't think he particularly liked being outshone by I don't know. I was in my early 20s then, but I'm still a young man. But and then in 2013, I took over the gallery. I bought out his shares, and the gallery became mine entirely. And then in 2016, we moved to our ground floor location at 545 West 20th Street in Chelsea, which was only a couple doors down from where we had been, but we had been, just kind of working, doing the Lord's work sort of in obscurity at 529 West 20th, so just a couple doors down. But I went to Pitzer College, which is one of the Claremont colleges in Claremont, California, one of the 5 Cs. And I've always had an interest in, just as a kid, in everything. I was always rooting for the underdog, and I was always looking at the things that other people weren't looking at. I was always interested in the things that other people weren't talking about, the places where lights weren't being shown. Not being able to find information about something only made me more interested, and so, but anyway, and when I started my gallery, I had a list in my head of artists that I thought were being underserved, or they weren't just being underserved, they were invisible entirely in the market. And when I started working more with contemporary artists who happened to be Native American, it was just another subset of artists that I saw as, being historically underappreciated, but, and that there was some urgency there. So, yeah, that's it.
Okay. Well, tell us a little bit more about Scholder and his contributions to contemporary American art history.
Yeah, okay, so I'm just going to move around for a second. So yeah. Fritz Scholder, super important. He and John Quick to See Smith are probably the 2 most significant contemporary American painters who happen to be Native, maybe in history. Unfortunately, Fritz Scholder's no longer with us. He died at 67. Which is very young. Jean is still with us. She's 84 years old. They're contemporaries. They were friends. Scholder took his Native ancestry seriously and was culturally Native, which is important. He had a home on the Louisiana Reservation. He studied at Sacramento State College with Wayne Thiebaud, also under Oscar Howe at a different time, and then was founding faculty at a place that's still very important to many contemporary artists who happen to be Native, a lot of young people, called the Institute for American Indian Arts, and that's in Santa Fe, New Mexico, or near Santa Fe. He was founding faculty there. It was the art department was him and Lloyd Kivanu, both teaching very different things. But Scholder's painting, was definitely pop influence. You're right in having noticed that. Thiebaud's work is pop, but also sort of just very painterly and pop adjacent. But yeah, so he was very much influenced by Thiebaud. He and Thiebaud actually founded a space together. Near Sacramento, like an alternative artist-run space. So they were, of like minds about a lot of different things. Their subject matter was radically different, certainly after some time. But his influence is undeniable, as is the influence of artists like Francis Bacon. Bacon was hugely important for Scholder. But Scholder is, he's a case study in this really interesting thing that Jean Quick de C. Smith, who was the first artist, this was not this past spring, but 2 springs ago, the first artist in the history of the Whitney Museum of American Art, which is the most important American art museum in the world, arguably, to have a retrospective. She was the first Native person to have a retrospective exhibition there. So that was spring 2022, spring 2023, rather. And Jean talked about shattering the buckskin ceiling. That's what she called, her breaking through into the kind of art world mainstream. And Scholder is really interesting because he's sort of a case study in hitting, again and again, this buckskin ceiling. And he was this renowned painter who made these really, really, really recognizable and famous Indian portraits from 1967 to 1980, which are the subject of our current exhibition. We chose his most recognizable body of work before kind of going into anything, since we also represent the estate officially, but we chose the most recognizable body of work because it's the kind of low-hanging fruit and it's what people sort of know. But he had a lot of success, like while he was alive. He was definitely the most famous American painter who happened to be indigenous. Andy Warhol painted his portrait. Warhol, one of the last things in the Warhol estate sale at Christie's, if you look in the catalog, this is after Andy died, was a Fritz Scholder painting that he purchased. So he was well regarded, and he showed, at galleries all over the United States, including New York, until the early 90s. The 90s, he kind of quit. And I think that's where the sort of buckskin ceiling thing comes into play. I think he kind of got tired of being the most famous contemporary American, painter who happened to be indigenous, because, when he tried to kind of step outside that, he was sort of, told, nah, you're still like this other type of artist, you belong, in regional markets around, America. That's where your work belongs. That's where the museums and private people will collect it. And I think, after, being told that enough times, he just, he had always sold very well, quote unquote, regional America. So maybe west of the Mississippi River. It's quite large and there's plenty of money, and there were plenty of places for him to put things and sell, plenty of places and ways to sell his work. And so he just kind of said, okay, well, I'll be that guy because this is all that's being offered me, and I'll have a fabulous house in Galisteo, New Mexico, just like Georgia O'Keeffe, and I'll have a gorgeous home in Scottsdale, Arizona, just like all of these rich white people. And, I'll drive whatever kind of car I want to drive and make my work and ride off into the sunset. And that's kind of what he did. Didn't have a solo show, since I think 1991 was the last solo exhibition in New York. And then he died in 2005.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, that's a good kind of recap history of him and his art and his life. Can you tell us a little bit more about the contemporary art market for artists who happen to be Native American? It seems like a lot of these artists are kind of having a moment that have been overlooked in the past, but are are having a moment and speak on the market
Yeah,
trends
well,
of the last 5 years or so.
yeah, I think that, I mean, the broader market trend has just been inclusion and expanding the canon, of American art history, also global art history. And the canon's been expanded significantly to include African American artists. And, sort of, it occurred to me a while back that, it was only a matter of time before, if the canon was truly going to expand, that it would embrace all Americans, and, the canon can only expand so much, right? Like, you have to, quality is important. You can't just kind of like, it's not like an open call, you know what I mean? And everybody who's, this color, this ethnicity, this, sexual orientation. That doesn't mean like, okay, now we're going to let everybody in from, a particular or a given group. However, there are certain artists who, have always been, and I always say this, that the cream always rises to the top. There are certain artists that have always been historically significant, that were influential, that changed American art history. They're these important figures, and a lot of them are hiding in plain sight. And so I, kind of swiftly, when I studied contemporary art in undergrad, so that was, my degree was in contemporary American art history. And I studied with a guy named Bill Anthus, who wrote a book called Native Moderns, which was about kind of a who's who of contemporary American painters who happened to be indigenous. And so I had this list in my head, and at the top of the list were Jean Quick to See Smith and Fritz Scholder. So when I saw this opening in the market, and when I saw this willingness in the market to embrace these figures, I, immediately started acquiring as many works as I could by Scholder, because at the time, like when I first started acquiring the work, I didn't represent him. I didn't represent his estate. It took a long time to get that official good housekeeping seal of approval. But John, signed up very quickly, and so Fritz was kind of next on the list. But the room in the market is for these, kind of important figures around whom, there's a consensus of value between scholars and historians, and then, collectors and institutions. Um, uh, that's where the for lack of a better characterization, that's where the money is, and that's where, and that's where it'll stay. And those are the artists that'll continue being collected by institutions. They'll continue being displayed in institutions, and people will continue, supporting their work. There will be a rash of, because the market is more open to things that it wasn't paying attention to, maybe say 15 years ago. There is, going to be a group of younger artists or mid-career artists of a particular stripe or color or belief system or whatever that will be, briefly anointed. But the ones that stay are the ones that have always been there. And Scholder is one of those artists, and so the trouble with Scholder was that, he had already had all of this regional success. And the trick with Scholder is not to establish him as a significant American artist. It's to, and this is kind of the trick with any contemporary artist who happens to be indigenous, is to remove that sort of regional importance, or replace the sort of regional importance with a national and international importance. Give them a national and international profile, as opposed to having them sort of relegated to a place that has a high concentration maybe of native people, or people who collect things native for ranch homes or whatever. That's the trick, And so the point of our current exhibition, and we've had tremendous success already with institutions and some private individuals on the East Coast, where I would argue indigenous Americans have the least visibility and cultural capital. we've been successful, and but those are the places where the work just isn't. You can go to the Eiteljorg, which is a very important repository of things native, including a lot of contemporary art in random. I don't know exactly where it is in Indiana, off the top of my head, but it's in Indiana. You could go there and you could see a Scholder and a Jean Quick to see Smith and probably a George Morrison and an Oscar Howe and a T.C. Cannon and any number of other important contemporary artists who happen to be indigenous that I can think of. But that's not going to move the needle. What's going to move the needle is walking into MoMA and seeing a gigantic Scholder or the Whitney, so that's the point, and that's what we're trying to do. And that's been the Scholder project from the beginning, whether we represented the estate or not. But
and that's where I'm kind of going with my final question, which is, where do you see this particular market going in the next few years?
Well, there's always been a lot of interest in Scholder because he was already established as this important figure, and so many people already had the work. So there was already, because the work was already in so many different places, there was a primary market for the work because there was an estate, a gallery that worked with him in New Mexico. And then, so many people had acquired work while he was alive that, the market is already there. And he appears at auction and does very well, better and better. And so their market is there. The market's only with our representation and our kind of re-presentation, framing and kind of positioning of Scholder. It's only going to grow. And I mean, exponentially. And there's no reason why a Scholder painting that currently trades for $400 or $500 or $700,000 shouldn't, in a couple of years, once there's some big splashes publicly and some notable private sales and some more institutional visibility, why it shouldn't make 900, $1 million, $1.2 million. It'll just continue, it'll just continue growing. And the supply is there too. It's not like, there's just none of these things that they're just going to dry up. I mean, he did make enough work to support a market, fortunately, we have quite a bit of the best work. And that's that. So, but it's going to grow, and it's going to grow for Jean Quick to see Smith and for a lot of other people. But when I say a lot of other people, it's very important to remember, whether you invest with Scholder or invest in Scholder rather, or Jean or any of these other artists that I've mentioned, it's important to remember that, when I say a lot of people, I'm talking under 10, but that's still a lot. That's more than before, which was none, or, a bunch of stuff in a dusty, display of ethnographic objects. So that's the goal, is removing the work. It's very common in the American West to have, or west of the Mississippi, to have a collection of things from the region, which ultimately will include parfleshes and, cradle boards and all kinds of Indian artifacts, and then contemporary art, just to prove that, like, well, indeed, indigenous people still make things and they are still alive. That's not, we're after the contemporary art market. That's the, and the contemporary art world. Capital C, capital A, capital W. That's the whale that we're trying to spear. So,
well, thank you, Garth. I think that this has been really valuable, just to learn more about you, what you do, and in particular about Fritz Scholder. It sounds really promising. Like there's a wave, like you said, the reframing, rebranding. Our daughter, I feel like this has become a family affair. Our daughter was at the opening or showing, whatever you called that you had, and she said it was a really great turnout. She was somewhat surprised by how many young people were there, which I don't know if it's attributable.
So was I.
Yeah, really?
Yeah, so was
okay.
I. It was a different crowd.
I see that as like a promising thing for this, being kind of a wave of the future. So
it was also interesting to see the number of finance people that were there. I mean, we don't normally get, people from fintech it was interesting. It was a different crowd for sure.
Well, congratulations, and thank you for your time. Enjoy the mountains.
I will.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Bita. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.